For a long time, Canada believed the matter was closed. The fighter decision had been made, the winner selected, the paperwork signed. The future, at least on paper, looked settled. And then, unexpectedly, Ottawa slowed down. Not because the threat environment suddenly changed, not because a new adversary emerged overnight, but because a proposal from Sweden reopened a question Canada had carefully avoided for decades. What if the aircraft already chosen isn't the aircraft Canada actually needs? This isn't just about jets. It never was. It's about who controls the systems meant to defend Canadian airspace. It's about how much autonomy a country retains when security depends on external approval. And it's about whether long-standing assumptions still hold in a world where geography, supply chains, and alliances are under strain. Canada isn't just purchasing aircraft, it's buying into a worldview. Assumptions about allies, about future wars, about where threats will originate, and who ultimately holds the switch. For years, those assumptions went largely unquestioned. Then, a single offer landed on the table and disrupted the entire equation. Not with rhetoric, not with political theater, but with logistics, numbers, and a reality the Arctic does not allow anyone to ignore. Because this story isn't really about the F-35 or the Gripen. It's about dependence versus control. And once that question enters the room, it doesn't leave quietly. The proposal itself was hard to dismiss. 72 Gripen E fighters, 6 GlobalEye airborne early warning aircraft, domestic assembly, maintenance, and long-term sustainment inside Canada, and a projected creation of more than 12,000 Canadian jobs. On paper, it looked like more than a procurement offer. It looked like industrial sovereignty, the kind Canada has quietly pursued as global supply chains fracture and alliances grow more transactional. What made the proposal more disruptive was that the Gripen was never supposed to be part of the conversation. In earlier evaluations, it barely registered. The scoring gap was decisive. The narrative closed before it ever opened. Ottawa moved on, but Sweden didn't. And neither did defense analysts, who remembered what the aircraft had done when conditions were harsh and expectations were low. Because the Gripen has a history of exposing flawed assumptions. And that history was about to matter. For years, defense circles have quietly discussed the aircraft's performance in exercises and operations. Reports from multinational air combat drills described outcomes that surprised observers. Not because the Gripen dominated every scenario, but because it consistently outperformed aircraft far more expensive to fly and maintain. These weren't isolated incidents. They repeated again and again. Analysts watched scenarios where Gripen scored against larger platforms through coordination, electronic warfare, and pilots trained to operate without perfect support. Then came real-world validation. During operations over Libya, the aircraft flew missions, gathered intelligence, and integrated seamlessly into coalition frameworks. It wasn't just an exercise standout. It was operationally credible. Still, none of this initially shifted Ottawa's decision, because Canada wasn't searching for surprises. It was searching for certainty. But certainty depends on where you expect to fight. And that's where the Arctic enters the story. Canada's geography is unforgiving. Its airspace spans nearly 10 million square kilometers. Much of it lies in regions where temperatures plunge, infrastructure is thin, and bases are separated by enormous distances. In the Arctic, long runways aren't guaranteed. Logistics chains don't always survive, and response time isn't a luxury. It's the difference between presence and absence. This is where the Gripen's design philosophy becomes difficult to ignore. It wasn't built for pristine bases. It wasn't designed around massive maintenance crews. It was engineered for disruption. Short runways, highway operations, rapid servicing by small teams, minimal turnaround time, the ability to keep flying even when systems degrade and conditions collapse. By contrast, other aircraft excel in environments where infrastructure is stable and support is guaranteed. The question Ottawa began quietly asking wasn't which jet is superior on paper. It was which jet survives when plans fail. And in the Arctic, that question carries weight. Then there's cost. Not the purchase price, the operating cost. Multiple reports place the Gripen's cost per flight hour at a fraction of some competitors. And that gap isn't marginal. It's massive. That difference doesn't just affect budgets, it affects readiness. Aircraft that cost less to fly get flown more. Pilots remain sharper. Coverage becomes constant instead of symbolic. In remote regions, affordability isn't about saving money. It's about sustaining control. Some analysts argue that a small number of extremely advanced aircraft flown sparingly may leave gaps that cheaper, more flexible platforms could cover continuously. That idea cuts against decades of procurement thinking, because it suggests the best aircraft isn't always the most advanced. Sometimes, it's the most usable. That realization leads directly into the next uncomfortable subject: stealth. Stealth dominates modern defense marketing, but stealth is not invisibility, and it isn't permanent. It relies on enemy systems behaving as expected, on radar assumptions holding, on constant software updates. The Gripen takes a different approach. Instead of disappearing, it disrupts. Electronic warfare systems designed to blind and confuse sensors. Networked data sharing that turns multiple aircraft into a single combat web. Each jet feeding real-time information to the others. Add long-range European missile integration, often described by analysts as extremely capable, and the aircraft becomes less about individual dominance and more about collective effect. It isn't flashy, but it works, which raised an uncomfortable question. If the Gripen performs this well, why did it score so low? The earlier evaluation wasn't wrong, but it was shaped by its priorities. Interoperability with U.S. led command structures was weighted heavily, not as one factor, but as a defining one. Adaptability, cost, and independent operation mattered less. When requirements are built around a specific ecosystem, the platform designed for that ecosystem will always win. Another overlooked factor was time horizon. Projected performance decades into the future was treated as guaranteed. Software upgrades not yet written were assumed advantages. Present-day operational reality was discounted. That raises a critical question. How reliable are 40-year forecasts in a world where warfare evolves every 5? Once doubts surfaced, pressure followed. Concerns about alliance cohesion, about interoperability, about shared defense. Some reports suggest Washington quietly signaled complications if commitments changed. Trade implications were mentioned in diplomatic channels. Nothing was framed as a threat. It didn't need to be. The message was subtle. Choices have consequences. But history complicates that narrative. Canada defended North America for decades with different aircraft. Interoperability existed long before modern platforms. Cooperation didn't vanish because systems weren't identical. So the question persisted. Was this about security or control? Running 2 fighter platforms is expensive and exhausting. Training pipelines, maintenance crews, spare parts, software cycles. For a smaller air force, duplication isn't inconvenient. It's structural strain. That's why Canada historically avoided split fleets. One aircraft, one doctrine. But the world that logic served no longer exists. What analysts are now discussing quietly is a compromise once unthinkable. A 2-tier force. One aircraft optimized for alliance missions and high-end conflict. Another for sovereignty patrols, Arctic response, and sustained presence. On paper, it looks messy. In reality, it reflects how threats are distributed. The Arctic doesn't demand constant stealth dominance. It demands endurance. Walking away from commitments outright would be politically explosive, but clinging too tightly risks limiting autonomy. And refusing to confront the trade-off is itself a decision. This moment is different. Canada can no longer hide behind process. The choice will signal how Ottawa sees its role in a changing world. As a junior partner optimized for integration, or as a sovereign actor willing to accept friction in exchange for control. Once that signal is sent, it cannot be undone. This was never just about jets. It was about what happens when security and sovereignty stop pointing in the same direction. The Arctic isn't a future problem. It's a present one, and it rewards readiness today. Canada's skies will tell that story. Not through speeches, not through press releases, but through what flies and why.